is really what Student Energy does. Student Energy creates interesting and diverse conversations on energy topics. So some of our highlights in the past have been a debate on the oil sands that featured Matt Fox, who at the time was the president of ConocoPhillips, and Andrew Nikiforuk, who wrote the book Tar Sands, so two very polarized perspectives. In Norway, in June, at our 2013 summit, we did a panel on Arctic drilling with Greenpeace and Shell. So we're really good at creating these interesting dialogues. Today, our dialogue is a little bit different. It's not really what I would call polarized, but it's definitely one that brings some diverse perspectives together. So what we've put together for you tonight is a panel that focuses on various portions or sectors within the industry. So we have a representative from the actual industry, and a representative from media, a representative from academia, and a representative from the NGO or not-for-profit community, each with their own diverse perspectives on energy. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to welcome up Claudia Cattaneo. Claudia is a Western business reporter for the National Post, and she covers energy on a variety of topics. So Claudia is our media representative. Thanks, Claudia. Sorry, I have no hands. It's yours. Next, I'm going to welcome up Chris Bloomer. Chris is the current CEO of Connacher Oil Gas. Chris has a long history in the oil and gas industry, including his past work at Petrobank, correct? At Petrobank. So Chris is our industry representative. And thank you, Chris, for coming here. We'll do this. Maybe. Next, I'd like to welcome up Ed Whittingham. Ed, I was telling Ed when I asked him to speak that when I first started working in the energy industry, I actually saw Ed speak on a panel, and it was one of the things that inspired me to get really engaged in the energy industry. So it's really exciting to have him here because of that kind of personal connection. Ed is the executive director of the Pembina Institute, which is a think tank on energy and sustainability here in Canada. Ed is a very respected voice on the sustainability portion of oil and gas and all energy. So thank you, Ed, for being here with us tonight. And I guess we're going to start without David Keith. One of his employees just told me that this is normal, that he might be a few minutes late, so don't worry. We'll get him here as soon as we have him. So I just want to start by letting each of the panelists give a few-minute overview of the role that they see their portion of the sector playing in the future of energy and how they can help to shape it. So, Claudia, we'd like to start with you talking a little bit about media.
Okay. So, thanks for including me in this discussion. As mentioned, I've been covering the energy sector for many, many years, and I care deeply about this subject. And by the way, I'm actually a columnist, and there's a bit of a difference between a columnist and a reporter. So as a columnist, I do almost exclusively opinion pieces, so I usually take a stand. And I work for the National Post, the financial section of the National Post, and I write mostly for a business audience and an investment audience. First of all, I just want to...
closer. Is it on? Sorry, 1 second here. Oh no, it's, yeah, just hold it a little closer.
Okay. Yeah. So first of all, I kind of want to touch on the things that I think are major consideration to achieve a future for the energy industry. And I think that there's four really important things that need to happen. I think that we need development that achieves the best value for our resources, and this means that we need to have new markets for our oil and gas. I think that we need the impact on the environment to be as minimized as we can. And through things like sharing of best practices and through technology development. I think that we also need to get First Nations on side and make sure that they have a fair chance of being partners in what's going on. And fourth, we need strong rules by government. And I believe, and I've expressed this in many of the columns that I've written over the years, that we can achieve all of these objectives at the same time, and that they're not mutually exclusive. In fact, I also believe that there's a consensus building across this country that we can do all of these things together, that we can be good at all of these things. So as a member of the mainstream media, my role really is to try to inform the debate. And I can tell you that I'm relentless, and so is my newspaper. I'm not agenda-driven. I consider myself to be independent, or as independent as you can be, keeping in mind that I have an audience, and it's a specific audience, and it tends to be the business community. At the Financial Post, like in a lot of other mainstream media, we have expanded our energy coverage over the years by a lot, actually. We have elevated its profile, and we now have a dedicated energy channel. It's called FP Energy, and so FP Energy, we have a print platform, so that's the traditional newspaper. We have a very good online platform. And it's extremely popular. In fact, it's the most popular section right now in the Financial Post. We get more readers than stuff like finance and the economy and so on. And we know that many policymakers and decision makers read it, and so do a lot of people around the world. So a lot of our readers are in Canada, they're in the United States, but they're also in the UK, in Japan, and across Asia. People are very interested in what happens in the energy sector here in Canada, both because they're investors, but also because I think that we're coming up with a new model here of responsible development that's not happening elsewhere. So as a journalist, as a columnist, I really try to bring a reasonable voice. And I have to say, frankly, that I feel like I'm often caught between these two extreme camps. And on the one hand, there's the oil industry, which I believe has a good story to tell, but is lousy at telling it. And on the other hand, I believe there's the environmental movement, and it has not as strong a story to tell. It's all about doom and gloom, really, but is very good at telling its side of the story. So what do I do? How do I inform the debate? I often get asked that. I try to do it by giving up voice to people who wouldn't otherwise have it. So I spent a lot of time in my, over the years, for example, talking to First Nations, because they are affected by energy development probably more than anybody. They often live very close to big projects, and they have views and they have concerns, and often they can make big contributions. I do it by really trying to keep issues in front of policy and decision makers, ask the questions, and hold them accountable. I also do it by trying to separate the facts from fiction. And really, we see it from all sides, whether it's the oil industry, whether it's the environmental movement, whether it's other players. And as a columnist, I reject extreme views. I try to showcase the good initiatives, and generally I support what I think is good for our country. So that's the role that I play.
Great, thanks, Claudia. One follow-up question. You mentioned giving voices to those who might not have them otherwise. How do you balance these disparate voices and make sure that perhaps there's not voices overshadowing those that are from a smaller portion of the population? Or do you feel that is important? How do you make that balance amongst the disparate voices?
Actually, often it's about availability. We see how people all the time. whether it is the First Nations or environmentalists or CEOs or regulators or government reps. So we pitch interviews constantly, right? And very often people actually seek us out. And generally, if what they offer is newsworthy, if it adds to the story, if it adds to understanding of issues, if it airs particular that need to be aired. So yeah.
May I just say how much I love technology? It never goes the way that you want it to. Thank you, Claudia, for that. That's really informative. And I want to get into the discussion portion a little more about what role social media and mainstream media play. All right, so David Keith has joined us. Hi, David, thanks for joining us. David is a professor at Harvard University, and he runs a company here called Carbon Engineering that works on direct CO2 air capture. And so David is representing our academic side tonight. But next we're going to go to Chris Bloomer to give kind of an industry perspective about the future of energy and really what role you think the industry plays in it. It won't go on? I love technology. We'll just leave it. We'll just share. Okay. Okay. Sounds good.
Can you hear me? Oh.
Yeah. Yay. Success.
Thanks, Kaylee, and thanks for Student Energy for the opportunity to get to know the organization and get to know some of the folks that are involved in it, because I think it's truly an amazing. I'm not trying to be patronizing. I think that these things grow from small beginnings, but once, and again with social media and so on, it has a tremendous impact. And I think being a voice for information, dialogue, and being able to communicate with a broad audience on the subject of energy is critically important. So I appreciate the opportunity. Representing industry is a pretty heavy thing. So I'm not, there's a pretty broad way to approach it, but I think the way I see it is that energy is in everybody's future. Nothing happens without various forms of energy, and we know that change is always going to be happening. But as a, let's say, a representative of industry, and our company Connacher, and I'm planning on having our next AGM exactly like this one, in the same time frame. So I learned something tonight. But I think that one of the key things, and some of the questions that were posed to us are around what's important and how things are going to evolve. From an industry perspective, we produce energy. That's our job. We produce energy. Our company is an oil sands producer. It has about 14,000 barrels a day of production. We produce the oil, we move it to market, we run the business from beginning to end. So it's a very good perspective on how things are run. And I think that one of the key things that always drives the industry, and is to provide energy economically, efficiently, and to provide jobs and opportunities. That's kind of a collateral benefit of all that. But fundamentally, we're in the business to produce energy. We're in the business to make money also, and that's what drives the economy. But what the industry has been very good at is working with and evolving with technology. In my career, I started out when all wells were vertical. That's way back. Everything was basically 2D seismic and a guess, and we've evolved to 3D seismic, enhancing things, on that way, being able to see through layers of rock that we've never seen before, and finding vast energy resources. We learned how to drill horizontal wells. And in my career, that was a very controversial, kind of crazy notion. What do you mean you're going to drill horizontal? What's that going to do? But now that is the mainstay of our business. Offshore, the ability to complete things subsea in great depths and do them efficiently and effectively has changed things. Multi-stage fracking and so on. And in the business that we're in, the oil sands side, that's taken 50 years to kind of evolve. And I think, I've been involved in developing technology around that too, and it's changing, and it is an important thing to keep changing and getting better at what you're doing. So we look at new technologies, and that's what the industry is driven by, is to be able to innovate, take on board new technologies. For instance, our facilities use evaporator technology for processing water, and we're able to recover 97% of the water. But at the time that was put in, that was crazy talk. Nobody does that. That's not going to work, and it was a challenge. But now that's kind of the way to go. So the industry is continuing to evolve, and I think we have to really focus on industry as a driver of producing energy, whatever that may be. And I think that from a stakeholder side, I think one of the questions was, how do we work together on stakeholders and various jurisdictions? How do we do that? I think I kind of agree with Claudia in many ways in what she is saying, in that industry does work with a lot of different organizations, and there's a disparate kind of view of things, and everybody has their opinion right across the board. And industry hasn't been that great at delivering the message and kind of understanding and solving problems before they become problems in the kind of environmental world and the social world. And I think this kind of organization and this kind of dialogue will help with that, because I think the facts ultimately speak for themselves, and I think that that's what we've got to be driven by. I think longer term, in developing countries and so on, I think, one of my things in North America is I think that we need to be more focused on efficiencies and be more aggressive with that, because I think we can do a lot and show the way in new economies and so on. Repeating the same old cycle of energy use and development is not on. That's not going to be the way things are happening. And I think we need to be more efficient in how we deal with things. I think we need to look at a manifold or a multi-approach to energy development. But I think one of the key things that we don't talk an awful lot about is efficiency. And we do that in our business to try and wring out every last cent that we can out of our business. But I think as an industry and as government and as other stakeholders like academics and NGOs, I think that's a key thing that we need to focus on in the future. But I think the future is bright. I think that we've shown that in North America, the whole revolution of the oil business, and everything has growing pains. Everything we do has collateral issues that we have to deal with. But I think overall, I think that we're evolving in a good direction, and I think there will be alignment on a lot of these issues going forward. And I think the dialogue needs to be constructive, and I think it needs to be informative over the long term. And I think as an industry, we need to do a better job at that. But I think the future is bright, and I look forward to the dialogue and the questions going forward.
Great, thanks, Chris. One follow-up question. You talked a lot about technology, and do you feel that industry's the primary kind of caretaker of technology, or do you feel that there's a big role for academia, government as well in that, maybe even the not-for-profit space? Or do you think that's industry's responsibility?
No, I don't think it's industry's sole responsibility, because a lot of the ideas don't necessarily come from industry, but industry needs to apply the technologies going forward. And I think there is there's a lot of organizations. COSIA is one. There's IC. There's groups in the federal government. Saskatchewan. There's University of Alberta and Calgary. There's all these areas are working on ideas, and I think that the integration of those ideas and the implementation and there's a lot of risk because people have to put capital into this and they're doing it to make money at the end of the day. But I think that has to be the theme, is it's not industry's purview to develop technology. Its purview is to take those technologies and develop them into commercial applications that benefit everybody. And that's a huge challenge.
Great, thanks. Okay, Ed, a kind of not-for-profit or think tank approach to the future of energy.
Sure. Is this mic on, Caleb? Is the mic on now? Even I can hear. Yes. Kaylee, and I just must say off the top, thanks for the nice shout out. Because you go and you talk about your work and you never know the kind of impact it's going to have on someone. So it's really nice to get that positive feedback. And congratulations on everything that you've done to set up this organization. Glad to witness your AGM. I'd love to pull off an AGM in as brief a time as you did. But I just want to start because I had a little student moment myself this morning, because 10 years ago, I went off and I'd been a conservationist. I had more experience suing companies and actually working for companies. I thought, okay, I've been a bad cop. I'd better go figure out what it's like to be a good cop. And I schlepped off to business school in Toronto and studied, amongst other things, international business and corporate sustainability. But of course, you start, and if you do an MBA and you do business strategy, you have to go worship at the altar of Michael Porter. And if there are any business students out there, you know what I'm talking about. You learn about his competitive forces theory, nation-level comparative advantage. Well, here I am and running this sort of little 2-bit NGO in Canada, and then invited to this breakfast, and lo and behold, it's a small discussion with Michael Porter, who is taking his latest research and he's applying it, and by the way, a colleague of David's, and now applying it to some of the issues that we care about here with energy, resource extraction, but particularly how can you move from a corporate social responsibility frame to one that is more integrated and builds shared value. Now, it's not, not earth-shatteringly new, but the fact that you have someone like Michael Porter digging his teeth into it and the NGO that he helped to create gives him tremendous reach and access, and he can bring that message into corporate boardrooms across North America. So it's kind of this nice little flashback. But when talking about the future of energy, now, I'll say right off the top, I'm a lousy futurist. Like, a really lousy. You talk to Nelson Rubin or someone like that who can actually look. I have a tough time looking and seeing what's on my schedule the very next day. But put that aside for a second. If I were to look in the future, I'd kind of look at where we are in the present and extrapolate out. And I think in the present right now, we've got sort of 2 scenarios. One is the scenario I think that we all hope with energy, which is a hopeful scenario. I mentioned CSR. So you have companies dumping billions of dollars into CSR because they care about it, corporate social responsibility, they want to do the right thing. If you're concerned about things like the climate problem, we know where to look. 80 to 85% of our energy is coming from fossil fuels, 80% of the emissions coming from fossil fuels. So if you want to get a handle on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, at least we know where to look under the mattress. And we know that shifting to a low carbon or zero carbon economy, as difficult as that is to contemplate, it violates no theory of physics. It is physically possible to do. We'll talk about the reality in just a moment. And if you look and if you care about things like not just fossil fuel production, but renewable energy, we've got billions of investment going in. Some of that's being led by the Chinas and the Indias of the world. Half of the gigawatts installed globally in 2011 came from renewable energy, the 208 gigawatts. And you've got companies like Walmart that get it, are trying to retool themselves, maxing out energy efficiency, maxing out fleet fuel efficiency, and doing the right things. So that's sort of, if you want to look at just some of those indicators, that's the hopeful side, that, hey, we're on the path to a bright, clean energy future, which is what my organization advocates for, helping Canada's transition to a clean energy future. The not so bright, not so hopeful perspective is that at the very same time, happening simultaneously, we've got companies, and again, like CSR. I went to a conference, I was speaking at another conference today on CSR, and you get the same 10% of publicly traded companies showing up, as you did 10 years ago. We're really not broadening that envelope very much. Some companies care, most care very little. And superficially, they might have their CSR expert 14 floors above the CEO with no connection to the finance side, and it's really just lipstick on a pig. Again, that's a glass half full perspective. With the boom, with the high price in oil right now, it's just fueled oil and gas exploration. So again, if you're worried about fossil fuels and transitioning away, what we have now is just unprecedented reserves of fossil fuels around the world. And technologies like tight technologies, with the revolution in tight technologies, opening up shale gas plays, tight oil plays, that 5-6 years ago were unthinkable. And if you look at the IEA report from 2006, the word shale popped up about 6 times. In the last report, it popped up hundreds of times. You know, that's just how far the issue was off the radar screen back then. Even though we're spending unprecedented amounts of money on CSR and companies are reaching out, arguably, we're no more peaceful than we were in the pre-CSR days. You know, we talk about elusive social license to operate. There's plenty of conflict out there, not just NIMBYism, but if you've heard BANANA, standing for build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. And as a result, we've got energy gridlock in a lot of places. And this is not just with regards to the resource we have in our backyard and the oil sands, but you know, looking at wind development in Ontario, where Suncor sends someone out to go to a hearing, or Pembina brings a farmer out to talk about wind development in Ontario. You need police protection now. Honestly, we had OPP protection for our person because it's just so full of strife right now. So in spite of all this money and trying to reach out, arguably we're no further ahead. And then on this notion of it's physically possible to move to a low to zero carbon economy, as soon as you start layering in things like social acceptance, social license to operate, and economics, you realize that fossil fuels are arguably going to be with us still for a long time, and that transition is going to happen very slowly. And so down the road, if you're looking at a bold and fearless prediction, we'll have an energy plan that gets us to a cleaner energy future. It's going to involve the transition of fossil fuels. It's going to take a very long time. And in the meantime, you have scientists like David here who are telling us what the climate science is telling us. We don't have a long time. We might have to come up with a patch solution, some midterm solution, as we're trying to ramp down, get greenhouse gases low. But in the midterm, we've got this big problem with carbon pollution. So that's the glass half full perspective. And I think the reality is the two are simultaneously happening. They're simultaneous realities right now. Who's going to solve it? Well, us folks up here, I wouldn't put your faith in us, frankly. A lot of the students right now, if you're between 13 and 33, you're a millennial. You've got a different kind of ingenuity. You've got arguably a different value system. And you've got the real incentive, because you're going to be around in this world longer than we are. Not to say we're going to divorce ourselves from the problem. But can we get there? Yes. In what time frame? Really hard to say. To your last question, and sorry, I'm rambling before my colleague takes the mic. What does an NGO do? A group like Pembina, we do 3 things. We do research, advocacy, and consulting. So we research ideas and try to come up with policy questions and solutions we see to some of the big-ticket clean energy problems we face today. Advocacy, we're unabashed advocates in that we say, hey, here are the solutions, but we're going to go out, try to make the case for them with policymakers. I'm a registered federal lobbyist. I'm not afraid to say that, because in talking with a government, you need to go in and make the case for why we need to transition. And then lastly, we're a consultant. So we recognize we need to be pragmatic, solutions-focused, work with companies, put our money where our mouths are, and we do that as well. We've done lots of work with Conoco, many of the majors in town are the Fortune 500 transnational companies. So that's our role.
Thanks, Ed. One follow-up question. So I recently heard this analogy that when a plane takes off, the difference between landing in Alaska or Fiji is just, you know, a slight turn. And you've talked about 2 very different scenarios. What's the difference, do you think, between reaching one or the other? Or can you pinpoint it to any one or couple things?
Yeah, I think people caring. And you know, it's so easy to get distracted these days and turn yourselves off and not care. The one thing, in spite, you know, I listed all the glass half full aspects. The one thing that I am seeing, and it's partly generational, is I'm seeing greater concern and greater investment in, wow, we really have to do something that the status quo is no longer acceptable. The question is there going to be time, given some of the big, hairy problems we face? And not just climate change as well. I mean, let's look at 1 billion people still living on less than $1 a day in the world. Let's look at 1.4 billion people who have no access to electricity. I think, though, gradually we're starting to care a bit more. And if we can spark that and fan the flames of the care that we're seeing, say, amongst the great student movement in the US right now, I think that can get us to land in, we're going to say, Anchorage instead of Fiji, if Anchorage is your preference.
Great, thanks, Ed. Okay, David, quick little story about David Keith. He was one of our first speakers at our first International Student Energy Summit in Calgary in 2009. Not sure if you remember that, David, but you were our highest rated speaker at that summit. So there, now no pressure. What do you see academia's role, or how do you see the future of energy?
I think I'll try and say two things. One is to talk about where I think we are now, and what I think a job of academics is, and the other one is to say a little bit about how we might get somewhere else and throw some cold water on this talk about corporate responsibility, which I think is not a useful way to think about how we make corporations work well or public policy work well. So a few words about where I think we are. I'd say there are 3 grand energy challenges, and I'm not the sort of standardized thing to say. One is energy poverty. We've got, as Ed was just saying, order 1 billion people living with very inadequate access to modern energy, and modern energy would be enormously helpful to their lives. So there are roughly 2 billion people who cook on simple wood stoves that kill them by indoor air pollution. And if they had access to LPG, liquefied petroleum, or kerosene, they would be enormously better off. And they would not, in the short term, be better off by buying expensive renewables. They'd be better off by getting access to fossils that we like, because it would save their lives and allow them to get illumination and heat. So that's one of the grand energy challenges, poverty. Other one, or access. The other one is the challenge of the inequality of energy around the world, and it's linked to geopolitics. The fact that a big fraction of the oil is still held in the Middle East, and all the ways that shaped Middle Eastern politics since those modern states were devised by the oil powers. And the third is environment, on which there are many, many different parts, and they don't all go the same way. The 2 ones that I think about the most, and they're overwhelmingly, I think, the 2 largest, are, first of all, air pollution. So depending on how you count it, the total deaths from fine particulate air pollution from the energy system are around 2 or 3 million a year globally right now. And those are not particularly controversial numbers. We have them with really clean epidemiology, where we do these multi-city studies and divide out. Give you a sense of another way to say how big those numbers are. The US Clean Air Act, which had nothing to do with corporate sustainability or some happy hold hands together thing. It was hard law, which cost us at the peak roughly 0.7% of GDP in the US, real money. So when people say we never pay real money for environmental concerns, that just is nonsense. We did for ozone, we did for particulate air pollution, we did for water, we did for mercury, we did for lead. All those things, we made enormous progress in the first world especially, and now in China as well. And we did it not by companies kind of feeling good or working together, but by battles where eventually we passed hard laws, and then companies competed to win under those laws. So the point is, Babcock and Wilcox, for example, built a huge business doing sulfur scrubbers, and they built that business because there was a law that required them, essentially. And to give you a sense of how successful that was, when the Clean Air Act implementation is finished, it will have added almost a year to the lifespan of an average American. This is not a small amount. That's the flip side of that air pollution number. And those are pretty well audited numbers. There's not a lot of room, maybe it's 0.7, but it's not 0.1. So this is the kind of scale of what we're talking about. So access, inequality around the world, and environment, I'd say, are the 3 kind of grand energy challenges. We don't have a challenge of energy gross supply. There's lots of energy in lots of ways. We don't have a problem with industries somehow being the problem. Industries in the long run do what societies want them to do and alter what societies do back and forth. I think we have a problem with figuring out what we as a society want to do. I think that's really the central problem around climate, is that only a pretty small fraction of people think it's really worth acting seriously on climate. So I'll say a little bit about what I think some of the basic facts are and aren't, and then go to say a few words about more about how we might get there. So the debate about climate is filled with an enormous amount of hype in both directions. So you'll have, I think my job as an academic is to try and separate fact from values, to tell you what I think the facts are and what my values are, but to be clear about the fact that you cannot derive, as Ed sort of implied you could, you can't say that we have to act quickly. We can say what the consequences are for the climate if we keep doing what we are, with error bars, and people can derive their own judgments about how quickly you want to act based on what they care about. Very, very important to say that. So let's give you a sense of kind of the basic facts. What we're doing by all the use of fossil fuels, which is marvelous and has made the modern world, what we're doing is moving carbon from the lithosphere, deep underground, to the atmosphere. And you've got to ask, how does that compare to the natural process? Are we bigger? Are we smaller? I mean, we know there's all these natural carbon cycles. So you got to ask, what's the analogous carbon cycle? And that's called the degassing of the lithosphere. And that degasses at about 0.2, 0.3 gigatons carbon a year, and we're doing 10. So we're overwhelming the natural cycle by about a factor of 30, and that's a conservative number. We're not a small perturbation. We're not changing it by 10%. We're 30 times bigger. So we're accelerating the amount of carbon being transferred in the atmosphere in a way the world has not seen since the Paleocene-Eocene, 55 million years ago, when we had a big pulse of carbon, obviously not made by people, but a big pulse of carbon that for example, made extinct a big chunk of all the benthic fauna and really altered the world in really stunning ways, made a mass extinction. So that's the kind of thing we're doing, but that doesn't say that's necessarily bad. Just to be clear, there's nothing inherently bad about a warmer world. It will cause us trouble because we're adapted to a world where the sea level is the way it has been over the last 500 years or 1,000 years, and where crops grow where they grow, but we could adapt and will adapt as climate changes. The question of how we want to react to the fact, and it's a fact with uncertainty about how much the climate change, depends on people's values, how much they care about the natural world compared to sort of direct human impacts, how much they care about the distant future compared to the now, how much they care about people distant from themselves compared to us. Those are individual values, and climate scientists have no more hold on those values than anybody else. So when I put the facts together with my values, think we should put, if I was a voter, put some a serious effort to cutting emissions pretty fast, which doesn't mean 10 years, it means kind of half a century. But it means really bringing carbon emissions down towards 0.5 or 3/4 of a century, which is a very hard ask, but also very possible. So how to do it? And to be clear, you guys might not agree that that's the right thing to do. How to do it? I think that particularly in Canada, we've become locked up in a series of kind of confusing conversations that frankly we just heard about how we're spending this amount of money on corporate social responsibility, and we are doing this amount of stakeholder engagement. And I think there's very little evidence that that way of thinking has been a successful way to make progress on these problems. And I think we have really good evidence in the ways that have been successful. So I run a company as part of my job, and I think companies are really good at doing a pretty narrowly focused group of things, competing to win. And I also am an investor in a bunch of oil companies. I don't actually want them to waste their time spending a lot of money on CSR. I want them to compete to win under the rules of the game. Then I want the democracy I live in to alter the rules of the game. But to confuse those two, I think, really makes a mockery of effective, cost-effective public policy. So let's be clear. If we actually want to deal with the climate problem, we're going to have to alter the rules of the game to put a big price on using the atmosphere as a waste dump for carbon. We're going to have to do that in a way that drives some of the businesses that run this company, this town, out of business. And they're not likely to transition to doing something else, because when there are big changes like that, that's not what happens. Other businesses come and win. The people in them can transition, and the money in them and the technology of doing something else and be successful. But it's not likely those businesses will over the next 30 or 40 years if we do that. It's got to be honest about what the consequences are. But I don't think we do that by kind of vague spending on corporate responsibility. I think we do it by law. And that's what has been successful and cost-effectively successful before. So we have solved a lot of major environmental problems since the Second World War in the rich world. And essentially none of them were solved by consumer choice. None of them were solved by voluntary large-scale action. They were all solved by passing laws, and the best ones were where the laws were roughly transparent, so companies could compete effectively to win under those laws that basically set the changing terms of the game. And I think in Canada, we better to think more clearly about that. That doesn't mean that the corporations are the bad guys and the NGOs are the good guys. Everybody's a citizen. Corporations, when they're doing what they're doing under the law, you want them to do it. What you don't want them to do is to unfairly influence the democratic process. That's a separate story. Thanks.
Great, thanks, David. Thanks to all the panelists for your comments. Great, so now I've noticed a bunch of you taking notes. So maybe I'll just open it up for the first comments to be a little bit about what the other panelists said, and particularly how all these sectors can play together to change the future of energy or pick its trajectory, or maybe to change the democratic process in David's case. So anyone jump in with any kind of comments that you'd like to make about anything that the other panelists said, and then we'll get into a couple of more specific questions, if there is any burning questions. Yeah, Chris.
All right.
Is it green? No. No? Is it just green?
It's green here. Oh, I got it. Connected. Well, I just wanted to comment a little bit about what David was saying. I appreciate that perspective. I think that's as being a leader in the energy industry, we do focus on the things that you focused on. And I think over my career, I think that the most impactful things have come out in terms of regulation and so on, and we do abide by that. One of the bigger examples in the oil industry is sulfur recovery, SO2, and changing that dynamic and putting the laws in place. I remember, we're having arguments, oh man, this is going to cost us a ton of money and so on, but somehow we work through it and it's the standard now. So in my mind, that's a very good example of kind of what you're talking about. And that was a collaboration and recognition that there is an issue in driving towards a solution. And I think that's really important. And I think the dialogue has to be around that. What's rational? How do we transition? The timeframes and when we do it, and having an informed discussion around that stuff. So I think that is extremely important. And that's where industry and governments and the academic world can merge on that and move some of these things forward, because I see that's the thing that's going to drive change. I think we do have a passion in the industry, and we do try to do the best that we can. The CSR side of things, we do the best that we can, and that's an evolving situation too, and we have to kind of manage that through transitions also. So it's a thing that needs a driver, and we have to figure out what that is.
It's just important as you know very well, to think about what the real limits are. So if you run a major company doing oil sands operations, what seriously can you do about climate? Like, you have legal fiducial responsibilities to your shareholders. You can't just wake up one morning and say, I want to do this totally other business. Your shareholders will and should pull you in. And the business you're in is taking carbon out of the ground to give it to consumers so they can burn it and put it in the atmosphere. And if we want to have a stable climate, we can't have those businesses. And you need to distinguish between people's corporate jobs and their jobs as citizens. It's perfectly consistent for somebody in their corporate job to fight like hell to make their oil sands business go, and to vote to have a high carbon price. Those are not inconsistent things. They're different roles. Sure.
Actually, Dr. Keith and I have had this discussion before.
I don't think your mic's
Okay.
It's a social experiment where we learn to share.
It's a talking stick. That's it.
So I just wanted to pick up on your point that we need to separate the role of citizens versus the role of corporations. Corporations being driven by profit and winning and so on, and citizens having different values and different goals. Unfortunately, in my experience, citizens by and large do not want to make these tough choices. Like, again and again, they're saying they don't want sweeping climate change policies. And the polls show that all the time, okay? When it comes up as an election issue, they will always go for economic development. They will always go for jobs. And we've seen it in the BC election. We have seen it, we're seeing it now in the debate on Keystone XL pipeline. The vast majority of Americans want that pipeline approved. What's happening is that, yes, there are some citizens who are pushing for these harsh climate change measures, but unfortunately, they're contributing to a debate that's become very polarized, and that's not really getting us anywhere. It's actually counterproductive because it's stalling everything. It's causing policymakers to not make decisions because they're just too controversial. And so what do we have now? We have a whole bunch of oil moving on rail, causing more emissions than pipelines. We have farmers screaming that their grain is not moving because the trains are now devoted to oil shipments, and so that's where we're at, and this debate is just not working out, and it needs to change.
So what's the role of the press in doing that? Because I think, I mean, you said confidently people don't want. So you said two things. One, you said people always want to go for the economic option. Well, I mean, that may be true in the future. Nobody knows the future. It has clearly not been true in the past. And I think you have a responsibility as a journalist to speak, to be clear that you don't know the future. But in the past, for the reasons I just gave, I can give you the textbooks. We have time and time again in democracies made major decisions that weren't just for the economy. The Clean Air Act imposed costs, I said, that were order 1% GDP. We've had a whole series of laws in Canada, in the US, now even in China, that clearly demonstrate that at least in the world up until now, you're wrong. You may be right in the future, but I think you have a responsibility to be clear that if you were right in the future, that is, if in the future everybody did what you said, they didn't do everything but go for the cheapest option, that would be a total change. Since in fact, in the past, we mostly have made realistic compromises, not always the way I would have wanted, but we have clearly not always gone for the cheapest option. So we made laws that mandated catalytic converters, or that whole host of things. I could go on and on. Those things imposed real costs, and they weren't the cheapest option. So can you say again what you mean when you say people don't want it and always go for the most economic option?
Well, that's what's been happening.
Well, that's simply false. That isn't what's been happening.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't.
Okay, so are all the examples I gave made up? They are.
Well, okay.
So the Clean Air Act didn't cost anything? Did I make that number up?
People will pick jobs. There's
So-
no
so-
question.
Well, so I think that we're again talking about the polarization that's happening. There's definitely examples.
No, this is a simple matter of fact. So are you saying that in fact in previous times, people have always made a choice that was the most economic choice with no thing for the environment?
The green shift.
Are
Okay.
you saying that or not? It's a pretty simple yes or no. I gave you a bunch of examples.
Well, I think you're asking me an unfair question.
I think I'm asking you a very fair question. You made a strong claim, which I believe is factually wrong. I'm politely giving you counterexamples and asking you to retract.
I can give you a whole bunch of examples where people have picked the economy versus the environment. So, for example, Stéphane Dion was pushing for major environmental initiatives on climate change. He lost, okay? In the BC election.
So, but your claim was that people always went. And what I pointed out was that there's a whole, that the whole reason we made progress has been a whole lot of cases where in fact we did legislate in favor of the environment at real economic cost. That is in fact a history, and the Chinese are doing it now.
And I think it's also safe to say, maybe not that always, but people make choices inconsistently. And a lot of economics, for example, is built on the fact that people are rational beings, and maybe we're not. And in fact, we often aren't. So I think that Ed really wants to jump in here. I've been noticing that you have a couple things to say. So Ed, why don't we let you jump in here?
I'll rewind the clock to a few points ago. I was just fascinated observing this exchange. This is fun, right? This is what it's supposed to be. Is everyone having fun?
Diverse debate,
It matters.
Okay, well, good.
if you want to predict the future, guessing what happened in the past, agreeing on what happened matters because it shapes your judgment about the future.
Yeah. Okay. But because you're alluding to the polarization, and actually, Claudia, you're talking about the different sectors and the stories that they tell. So just one observation, and I was part of a few years ago a facts-based exercise around oil sands development. And by that, Pembina and 3 companies, who shall remain nameless, got together and they said, okay, well, we're concerned around polarization and that we're working from a different basis of facts. So let's actually throw some money and get someone to look at the different facts, map them out, and see how close are we. And once you discount sort of the left and the right, let's say once you discount the green pieces and the caps, who I think really, and I'll tell this to the executive director of Greenpeace, I'll tell it to Dave Collier, I think really stretch facts. Then you find that there's a really common set of facts that people are working from. The problem is right now, and I think this contributes to the polarization, the question I'd put is it a bad thing right now? But it's you've got, on one hand, NGOs who are looking at, say, the oil sands, and they're taking, well, what are the growth projections and NEB data or CAP data and say, well, we're going to build it out to 5.5 million barrels a day by 2030. So what are the environmental implications of that? They assume the worst case scenario in terms of the growth scenario. They take all the worst indicators, they aggregate them together, and they say, here's the total impact of that resource development. Worst case scenario based, future aggregated. But then on the other side, and sort of getting to telling stories, you have government and industry will look at the present. They'll take an indicator that's happening within the fence of one operation. They'll take that, the best case scenario, and maybe not aggregate it, but say, hey, look what we're doing. We've had increased water resource efficiency by 66%. Isn't that great? Inside one fence and completely disregarding what's happening with other operations. And therefore, it sounds like we're advocating from a very different fact set. So, I mean, the question that I would put to Claudia, to anyone here, if we want to open it up, Kaylee, is do we need to get away from that? And if you do get away from that, how do you reconcile those worldviews? Whereas one is very present focused and the other is very future focused.
And being selective about what's being shared. Yeah, exactly.
But then the greater question, and I love people's opinions on this, we talk about polarization as if it's a bad thing. And I in my job, I mean, it's terrible. I get hateful emails sent to me. I get hateful voicemail messages every time Ezra Levant, does something about Pembina on his show. I probably just emboldened him. By the way, he did that. I sent him some flowers. Because I said, hey, we're generating debate, and I got donations into the Pembina Institute because of you ranting and people so tired about that. So I sent the guy some frickin' flowers. But the polarization, we talk about in negative terms. But is it a bad thing? Because many times in history, we've had this kind of polarization before we actually make a great step change that gets us to a better place. So I just pose that as a question.
Does anyone want to answer and if polarization is necessarily a bad thing? And then I want to take that and flip it on its head a bit after. Yeah, Chris, go ahead. Or
yes, it is a bad thing because it's getting us nowhere. That's the problem. And what I see from my perspective as a member of the media is a whole bunch of bigotry. That's what I see. And it's very, very scary. And I think it's unfortunate. And I think we need to move to a different level of conversation.
But just, Claudia, by bigotry, how would you characterize bigotry?
Oh, has anybody seen the Steyr commercials? Come on. Okay?
Yep. I'm getting audited, Are you getting audited? Yeah. So, yeah, that's part of it. It goes both ways, right? But again, okay, well, it's a bad thing.
I think this is normal that these fights happen. So no big deals like this get done without a fight.
But I'd like to make the point, though, that polarization is great. Having debate is great. But when it borders on, like recently, there's some incidents around the Keystone XL where people show up at oil company executives' houses. They're banging on the door, calling them criminals. They're out there with pitchfork, literally with torches and signs and all that kind of stuff. When polarization gets to that point, then that's wrong. And I think that occupying facilities. I mean, I don't want somebody to show up at my door like that. And I think when you get into polarization's fine, but when that leads to debate and constructive dialogue, but when it dissipates off into civil disobedience that's destructive, I think that's a huge problem. And I think we've all got to stand up and say, you know, that's not right, that's not what we represent, and I think that's got to move forward. And I will say that, you know, Ezra has raised some issues. I mean, his style is not great, but I think you've got to look at the substance of some of the things he's saying, and not just dismissive of him on style basis. So I think that's an example of maybe listening to what the opposite side is without going off the deep end.
So for my part, I could not agree more that actions that target an individual like an oil company captain that way are wrong. I actually don't agree that civil disobedience is necessarily wrong. There's lots of examples of certain kinds of polite public civil disobedience that have been very successful in the world, and I think ones like the civil rights movement, and we may end up with something like that before we get serious action on climate. This isn't going to be over quickly or easily.
Oh no, I'm not saying that there's levels of everything, and I think that when people are willing to step up and put themselves on the line for things, but when it becomes a quasi-criminal type of activity or a criminal activity, and in Canada you seem to be able to get away with it because you couldn't do it in Venezuela, you couldn't do it in Russia, and you couldn't do it in China. That's an issue that we need to really tamp down.
So let me pick up on that. So what you just heard implied was that you can do this in Canada. And what I've heard several times, not from you tonight, but it was along the same line, I heard it from Ezra, is that, oh, the big environmental funders put money into fighting battles in Canada because it's easy and we have permissive laws and they can't do it elsewhere. I remember hearing that soon after I'd spent some time at Climate Works, where I found out that they put no money into Canada because they didn't think it was worth it, and were putting in what at that point was like $30 million a year into China. And the claim that you can't do that in China is a little insulting if you're a Chinese environmental activist. After all, several have been shot in the last year. There have been, even by the state government's count, thousands of protests. So those people would feel pretty insulted to hear an attitude like that.
But
the
why
fact
don't
is
we...
that this battle is happening worldwide in different ways, and Canada is not getting an especially large fraction of international flows of money. Indeed, many of the total about $300 million that I know of kind of activist money flowing in the U.S., much more flows to, say, China or elsewhere than to Canada.
But we don't hear about that. That's not what makes our headlines.
Not very hard. Well, yes, and that tells you something about who writes the headlines, how much fact-checking they do, and how much they're trying to spin, because the facts I quoted are not hard to find.
No, I'm not disputing that, but I think that that's the dialogue that needs to happen. There needs to be an informed communication on these things and a broader perspective. I think we're too narrowly focused.
Like I said, it says something about spin.
I think you guys are doing a commercial for student energy and the type of dialogue we try to create, so it's wonderful. Thank you for that. Ed, you seem to have one last comment, and then I'm going to switch to a question from the audience.
Just a comment, and Claudia, I mean, I think I'm like you. I'm a peace-loving Canadian, right? So I ultimately want to be a bridge builder. I want to get along, and for a long time, in the few years, we've had a hyper-polarized environment. Let's face it, it is hyper-polarized. It's like, well, this doesn't feel right to me. At the same time, with some exceptions, and we've agreed that the rule of law shall prevail, this polarization has actually created an opportunity for us to have this kind of debate in front of this kind of audience. Where five years ago, this really wasn't happening. It really wasn't happening. The student movement in the U.S. Has been a peaceful movement in a way with numbers that we haven't seen since the 1960s, rallying around largely an issue about our energy future and what are we going to do about this issue of climate. And as a result, and while I don't like I don't want people to show up at CEOs' houses, I don't want to get the hateful emails or phone calls that we get, right?
Both sides.
It's both sides. But those are on the peripheries. Generally, we're still able to have a Canadian civilized debate where we might disagree, but we're getting to the substance of the issues. And therefore, I've changed my mindset of running from the polarization to saying, well, this is an opportunity, and I think it's an inflection point. It may feel uncomfortable at the time, but my sense and my cursory look at history and social change movements is this has happened again and again, from the anti-slavery movement to the civil rights movement. And we just have to realize we're in this uncomfortable spot right now.
So one of the things that we notice with student energy a lot is there's kind of a lack of, and this is a question from the audience, there's a bit of lack of literacy amongst energy information, and this is a pretty big problem. A lot of students in particular feel that the information around energy is overwhelming, and really, when they look for it, it's quite biased. So whose job is energy literacy, or does it belong to one, pillar of the industry? Whose job is it to make sure that the public understands it, or is it a job at all? Anyone want to take that first? David?
I think it is partly, anyway, the job of academics. I don't think they do a very good job in general, but I think, in a sense, it is an industry's job, and it's very clear when you look at polling. People don't tend to believe industries when they tell you how good they are, because essentially they all do. I mean, whether it's toothpaste or airplanes or whatever, industries always say what they're doing is good, and so when you do polling, it's clear that people generally discount that. So I think the role for education does fall significantly on academe, and I think academe does a pretty lousy job at it. We tend to stuff people filled with a million detailed facts and do a very poor job at selling the kind of, telling the kind of big, simple story about energy that is fact-rich and allows people to draw different conclusions out of those facts based on what their values are.
Chris, do you want to take a comment? Do you mind sharing the mic? Talking stick?
Well, I don't think there's one kind of omnipotent source of energy information, and it is really challenging. And I think part of it is, and it's interesting I say the oil industry is a lousy communicator, and you're saying the academia is a lousy communicator on these issues. And I think we are, and I think we've got to find a way to do it, but there's not one avenue to do it. This is an example of one avenue, but I think that everybody's not going to be on the same page. Everybody's got a different viewpoint, so it is a real challenge. But I think trying to throw up what the big issues are, we've ranged from the energy industry here to talking about the global picture. That's a lot to digest, and that's really. I think you've got to have trusted sources, and you've got to be able to do that consistently. And I think the philosophy of this organization is to try and provide that. And I think those are the things that need to do. It's a multi-channel kind of communication. It depends on which channel you tune into. So there's not one source.
Yeah, and that, Kaylee, I mean, I would challenge the premise of your question, because it was almost like we're ascribing ownership.
Right.
You own the facts and you don't. I think that's dangerous thinking. Mm-hmm. So it's up to anyone. Anyone here, you want to set up your own pillar and get up and shout to the masses. Anyone in our democratic society has the right to do that. The question is, who are you going to believe? Who's going to have legitimacy for you? Who's going to have credibility? Who's going to have trust? And we know in certain areas and with who audiences and for which audiences and for what purposes. So I know, running the Pembina Institute, when it comes to things like facts to do with the oil sands, that reporters go to two places. They go to Pembina's site and they go to CAP's site. So rightly or wrongly, and Claudia might say, why would they go to Pembina's site? Because you stretch the facts. And I say, well, Cap, you stretch the facts. Rightly or wrongly, that's where they go. So we have captured legitimacy, credibility, and trust. Now, on the question of for what purposes, so that's great. We want to engender a good debate. Energy literacy might spur individual action as well. So we have to ask that question before we completely say, well, maybe it's the rule of law. Is there something that can be done on the individual action side? I'm quite pessimistic on that. Are we going to, just through greater education, get people to radically reduce their consumption of energy or drive down their carbon footprints? I don't think so. I don't think just because my phone can talk to my thermostat that's really going to get me to do anything, and if the pricing of energy is completely distorted the way it is now. So when it comes to how do you actually get people to move, I'm sort of siding with David in that you get people through the rule of law, you give them concerns around health. And Clean Air Act was fundamentally, and what we've done on air pollution has been around health concerns. That's the way you'll get people moving quickly and supportive of policy changes.
Claudia, do you want a word on this one? Maybe around social media as well. You've mentioned.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it's the individual's responsibility to be informed and to learn as much as they can about energy. But I also want to note that we have a lot more sources of information than we used to have. Our share of voice as the mainstream media is much smaller than it used to be, and that's because of social media, and there's way more sources out there than there used to be. 10, 20 years ago, people used to come to us to get their message out. People are now getting out their own messages. And so that makes it, for sure, a lot more challenging to get, I suppose, independent views and to get a consensus on facts.
And so this kind of goes back to Ed's point where it's the ones that have gained the trust and credibility in the minds of whoever the audience is, which can be very vast and diverse to choose that. So we're running out of time here, and at Student Energy we have a little bit of a tradition, and we call it the speed round. And so we're just going to go through each of you quickly and ask for one piece of advice that you would give to the students who are watching and who are potentially going to be making the decisions around the energy industry in a few short years. One piece of advice you'd give them in their careers or in their paths in the energy industry. One thing. I'm putting you on the spot, I realize, so it's a little... Anyone want to start? Everyone got one? David, we'll go this way.
Sure, I'll start. Sharpen your pencils and develop your own facts. Start with something like sustainable energy without hot air, which is just filled with numbers. And think about the following paradox. We're now spending almost $300 billion a year globally on clean energy, and we're getting almost nothing, very little for it in terms of reduced emissions. So the kind of NGO lobbyists have succeeded in getting a lot of money spent on clean energy. Look at Germany, but Germany's hardly cut its fossil fuel emissions. And so we're in this weird middle world where we spent gigantic amounts of money, 0.4% of global GDP on clean energy, but are actually getting little for it. And I think we're going to come to a crisis point where we start thinking hard about whether we should be spending more than nuclear power or other things that are more cost effective.
I couldn't agree with David enough around, if you're going to read one book on energy, read Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, David Mackay. For me, it completely shaped the way that I look at the energy picture. And just quickly, it looks on an energy equivalency basis, takes the UK and says, if you want to move to a sustainably powered UK, could you do it? What I was saying earlier, you wouldn't violate the laws of physics. Yes, it is possible, but once you start layering in social constraints and economic constraints, it is impossible to max out all renewables in the country, convert cropland, max out all the geothermal, all the tidal. It just isn't realistic. So that's why an organization like ours advocates for transition. It's going to take time. Start planning now. If you're a student, what can you do? I'm always partial to business students, having done a business degree. Go in and challenge your economics professors. Ask if they can subtract. Ask them that, can you just constantly grow an economy? If an economy is just a measurement of the toll you take out in the environment, can you perpetually grow? Or at some point you have to look at steady state economics. And that is, instead of the economy being here and the environment being subsumed within the economy, we're talking about outputs, a dumping ground. Should we not have the ecology here and just consider the economy as a subset? That is not taught in business schools. You have to go to ecological economists for that. That's, I think, the best thing you could do as a student.
I think one of the, if I'm not a great advice giver, but I think one of the key things is to be optimistic. I think that's be hopeful. I think kind of paralleling what David was saying is develop your critical thinking skills. Don't take things at face value, and that's hard work. So you can't avoid the hard work, and being optimistic are really key. We'll have these debates, we'll have this polarization, but it's in your best interest to think in a critical way, take the facts to yourself. That's hard work, and be optimistic.
I'm going to try to be a little different here. And actually, it's picking up on David's point that the climate change movement is going after all jurisdictions equally. I don't agree with that. I think that we are being picked on as a country because we're seen as a soft target. I've been to a lot of oil fields around the world. I can tell you that you don't even get into Saudi Arabia, let alone go there and protest. And we saw what happened to Greenpeace in Russia, didn't we? So if there's one piece of advice that I'd like to give you is Canada has shown pretty good judgment so far in developing its resources. And I think as Canadians, we need to set our own destiny. We're a sovereign country, and we need to be aware of agendas that perhaps are not in our best interest as a country.
Okay, so with that, we're going to wrap up. I just want to come back to the point about being a critical thinker and being an optimist, because I really think that's two of the pillars that Student Energy really stands for. It's that we try to help students to develop the skills to look at a set of facts or a set of sound bites or whatever it is and critically think if those make sense for their own situation or wherever they may be in the industry, in their own life, and as consumers and as citizens. One thing that I really challenge people to remember is that energy is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. No one actually cares about energy because we like barrels of oil or solar panels. We care about energy because it allows us to be transported towards each other. We care about it because it allows us to communicate. In the developing world, they care about it because it allows them to not have to cook with wood and take in a huge air pollution in their lungs. We care about energy because it allows us to advance and be productive. And so when we're thinking about these problems, it's really important to remember the way that we're framing them. And maybe it's not just about getting more energy and getting it cheaper and getting it to people quicker and cleaner. It's also about what we as human beings want and if there's creative ways to get that without necessarily just needing more all the time. So thank you so much for coming out to our first public AGM, despite all the technical little hiccups we had. I really appreciate you being here and all the support we've received from Calgary and globally on the webcast.